Chalk dust smells like nothing until it's on your tongue, and then it tastes like every promise that never paid out. 20 federal agents had been locked in a windowless room on the 14th floor for 71 hours, and the wall of corkboard in front of them still meant nothing. Coffee had gone from hot to cold to hot again 4 times. A woman in a threadbare cardigan, 5'2", hands raw from pinning hems since 6 that morning, would walk into that room without an appointment, without a badge, without being asked. 90 seconds later, the room would go so quiet you could hear the building settle. She wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't even sit down. It wasn't a plan. It was a stitch count. Morning arrived on Ashland Avenue, smelling of scorched, dry-cleaning solvent and the vinegar bite of pressed cotton. And that smell was Marisol Reyes's entire adult life, folded into one narrow shop, with a bell over the door that had rung wrong since 2019. One clear note, and then a rattle, like it was clearing its throat before it could finish the thought. She was 34. She had been 34 for what felt like 11 years. Marisol smelled like chalk and spray starch and, underneath that, a drugstore vanilla lotion she bought in the $2 travel size because the full bottle was $6.49, and that was $4.49. She didn't have on a Tuesday. Her hands told the truth her face wouldn't. Fingertips gone hard and shiny at the pads from 22 years of needles. A callus on the side of her right middle finger shaped exactly like a thimble, because for 6 of those years, she hadn't been able to afford one. The shop was called Reyes & Son, though there had never been a son, only her father, Hector, who'd hung the sign in 1994, hoping the name would arrive later, and had died of a heart attack in the back room in 2011, with a client's wedding dress half-hemmed on the form beside him. Marisol had finished the hem. She had not changed the sign. Rent on the apartment above the shop was $1,150. She had $917. She had counted it 4 times that morning on the bus, in her lap, under a coat, the way you count money when you don't trust yourself to have counted it right the first 3 times. The gap was $233. Her landlord, Mr. Petrakis, wasn't cruel. He was tired. Tired men give you until Friday. Friday was 2 days out. She rode the Western bus, Route 49, seat 14 from the back, because the heat event was there, and it was the only seat on the whole route where her knees didn't go numb by Roosevelt. She sat with a canvas bag on her knees, holding 6 garments to alter. 3 quinceañera dresses that needed a half-inch taken in at the waist, a suit jacket for a funeral tomorrow, and a wedding gown, ivory silk, that a bride named Theodora kept calling about, twice a day, to ask if it was still on track, as if track were a thing Marisol had ever once, in her life, been allowed to fall off of. At the shop, Delfino, 61, half-deaf in the left ear, owner of the dry-cleaning half of the storefront, the man who paid Marisol $14.50 an hour cash under a folding table arrangement, neither of them called illegal, talked over her the way people talk over furniture. He asked customers if they wanted the shirts on hangers or folded, and never once, in 3 years, asked Marisol if she wanted a raise, a break, a chair with a back that didn't dig into her spine. She existed to him at the level of the sewing machine, reliable until it wasn't, replaceable when it was. At noon she ate a peanut butter sandwich standing up, because sitting meant looking at the invoice pile, and the invoice pile meant looking at the number that said $233, and the number that said 233 meant looking at the number that said, underneath it, in her own handwriting, from 3 weeks back, call mama, surgery follow-up, ask about cost. Her mother's cataract surgery had gone fine. The follow-up visit had not been fine, in the sense that nothing involving an American hospital bill is ever, structurally, fine. She had one hobby, and it was the only hour of her day that belonged to her. At night, after the shop closed, after she'd eaten cereal standing at the counter because a bowl felt like a commitment to sitting down and never getting back up, she did cross-stitch. Not sentimental cross-stitch. No birds, no bless this mess. She did counted thread pattern work, the hardest charts she could find on a forum for people who liked math disguised as embroidery. Charts with 4,000 stitches and no picture on the front until stitch 3,800. Charts where one miscount on row 6 ruined row 200, and you wouldn't know it until the whole thing came out crooked at the end. She was good at it in a way she had never once been complimented for, because no one who mattered had ever seen her do it. Her brain held grids the way other people's brains held songs. Her apartment above the shop was 400 square feet and smelled, always, of whatever Delfino had run through the pressing machine downstairs that day. Today it was leather, a stack of motorcycle jackets belonging to a man who tipped in exact change and never once looked at her, bleeding up through the floorboards until it mixed with her own vanilla lotion into something that was neither smell anymore, just weather. She had a twin bed pushed against the radiator because the radiator was the only heat source that worked reliably. A hot plate instead of a stove because the stove had died in 2019, and Mr. Petrakis kept saying, "next month," the way men say things they've stopped meaning to do. And a cat named Poochie who ate the wrong bag of food, the discount pellets from the dollar store. Chicken and rice printed on a bag that, if you read closely, listed chicken fourth and cornmeal first, because the right bag, the one the vet recommended, was $34, and the wrong bag was $9, and Poochie did not know the difference, and neither, most months, did Marisol's bank account. She had 2 pairs of work pants, both black, both with the left knee gone thin from kneeling to pin hems, and she rotated them the way you rotate anything you can't replace, carefully, with guilt, checking each morning which one smelled less like the day before. Her winter coat was from a church rummage sale, size too big, sleeves rolled twice, and she told herself the extra room was for layering, which was true in December and a lie by February. She bought her groceries at the discount store on Thursdays because Thursdays were markdown day for anything with a sell-by date inside 72 hours, and she had gotten so precise about which register clerk let her buy the reduced meat without checking the date sticker too closely that she knew his shift schedule better than she knew her own cousin's birthdays. At the shop, invisibility had a shape. It was Delfino handing a customer's shirt across the counter and saying, "We'll have that Thursday," without once turning to confirm with Marisol, who was the only person in the building who actually did the work, and therefore the only person who actually knew if Thursday was true. It was customers who addressed her as Miss without learning her name across 3 years of weekly visits. It was the UPS driver who called her on and meant nothing cruel by it, and meant, underneath the not cruelty, that her name had simply never registered as worth the effort of remembering. She had stopped noticing the accumulation of it, the way you stop noticing a low hum in an old refrigerator, present always, audible only in the rare silence when it briefly cut out. She did not know that Tuesday morning riding the 49 with $917 and a bag of 6 garments, that this, the grid holding, the counting, the years of finding the one wrong stitch buried in 4,000 right ones, was about to become the single most valuable skill in the city of Chicago. Cedar and Gunoil arrived at the Drake Hotel 11 minutes before the deadline, wearing a charcoal suit that had never once, in its life, been wrinkled. Esteban Marchetti, half Sicilian by blood, half Sinaloan by the business he'd inherited at 26 when his uncle disappeared into a story nobody repeated twice the same way, did not raise his voice, because he had learned by the age of 19 that a raised voice was a tell, and Esteban Marchetti did not give tells. People who worked for him described the fear the way you'd describe weather. It was simply present, a pressure change you felt in your back teeth before you understood why. 3 days earlier, a shipment worth $41 million had gone dark somewhere between a warehouse in Pilsen and a port authority in Long Beach, and with it had gone the location, encoded, buried, camouflaged inside a set of ordinary household textiles his organization used to move information the way other men used burner phones. The system had worked for 6 years. It had never failed, until a rival faction, run by a man named Ruiz, who Esteban had once trusted enough to let stand behind him at his own mother's funeral, had intercepted the courier and the code along with him. The courier was dead. That part was simple. The code was not dead. That part was the problem. 10:14 a.m., 71 hours since the interception. 20 federal agents, a joint task force out of the Bureau's Chicago field office, pulled in after a wiretap had confirmed the shipment's value and the interagency panic that followed, sat in a rented conference room on the 14th floor of a building on LaSalle that did not officially exist on any building directory, staring at a corkboard covered in photographs of 6 quilts, 2 christening gowns, and 1 hand-stitched tablecloth, all recovered from a raid on a safe house 2 days prior. Somewhere in the thread was a location. Somewhere in the thread was a date. 20 of the best pattern analysts, cryptographers, and cartel specialists the federal government employed had stared at those stitches for 3 days and produced nothing but empty coffee cups and 1 agent's resignation letter, drafted and then deleted. Esteban Marchetti did not care about the agents. Esteban Marchetti cared about the $41 million and about the fact that Ruiz now held both the location and, if he decrypted it first, 11 of Esteban's remaining safe houses, coded into the same stitch language, waiting to be read by whoever cracked it. "Talk to me," Esteban said, quietly, to a man named Alvaro who ran his logistics and who was sweating through a shirt that cost more than Marisol Reyes made in a month. "The pattern guys say it's not a cipher, it's not math, it doesn't repeat. Everything repeats. Not this." Esteban set down his coffee, black, no sugar, in a paper cup he'd touch exactly once and then abandon, a habit 3 separate ex-associates had noted with the specific dread of men cataloging a predator's tells, and said the thing he would end up saying, in that same quiet register, 11 more times over the following 3 days, to 11 different people who each, in turn, went pale. Find someone who reads thread. Nobody in that building, for 3 days, understood that he meant it literally. 2 of them died misunderstanding it. Not from him, from Ruiz's people, closing in faster than anyone had accounted for, treating the delay itself as an opportunity. 47 hours left, by Esteban's private math, before Ruiz's people finished their own decryption attempt with cruder tools and far less patience. The clock did not exist on any wall. It existed behind Esteban Marchetti's sternum, where it had lived, ticking, since he was 19 years old, and had first understood that everyone he loved could be measured in hours remaining. His empire, such as it was, ran on textiles the way other men's ran on shell companies, quilts sewn in 3 trusted households across the city, each household paid in cash and silence, each household understanding, without ever being told outright, that the pattern in their work was not decoration. It had taken his uncle a decade to build the system, and Esteban 6 years to inherit it whole, refine it, and make it, he'd believed, unbreakable. No digital trail, no phone that could be seized, no server that could be subpoenaed, nothing but old women's hands moving thread through cloth, in patterns that looked, to anyone who glanced at them, like grandmother's hobbies. It was, he had told himself more than once, the safest system ever built, because it depended on nobody outside a small circle ever learning to read it, and reading it required a specific, rare, almost extinct kind of attention that modern life had trained out of nearly everyone. Ruiz had understood that too, once, back when Ruiz had been the trusted lieutenant standing behind Esteban at his mother's funeral, instead of the rival now circling from 3 warehouses south. The betrayal itself had cost Esteban very little sleep. Betrayal was weather, in his world, as constant as rain. But the $41 million was not weather. It was 11 safe houses worth of operating capital, 6 years of careful patience, and the only leverage keeping 3 separate factions from testing whether Esteban Marchetti had gone soft since his uncle's disappearance. The 20 federal agents on the 14th floor did not know any of that. They knew only that a wiretap had flagged the shipment's value, that 6 textiles had been recovered in a raid, and that whatever those textiles said, someone somewhere very dangerous wanted it kept quiet badly enough that 2 low-level informants had already turned up dead in the 71 hours since the raid, which was, for a federal task force, usually the fastest way to make a case's priority level jump 3 tiers overnight. Agent Priya Okonkwo had pulled 2 consecutive double shifts, trying to find the thread. She would have laughed, later, at her own unintentional pun, except nothing about that week was funny yet, and had begun, by hour 60, to suspect that whatever pattern hid inside the stitches required a kind of expertise that no cryptographer on the government's payroll actually possessed. She was right. She simply did not yet know where in the city that expertise was quietly hemming a wedding dress for $180 flat. By midnight Thursday, the air over LaSalle Street smelled of wet asphalt and the ozone tang that comes right before a storm breaks, and it was in that smell that the wrong bag of quilts got delivered to the wrong dry cleaner 3 blocks from where it should have gone. It was not supposed to happen this way. A federal evidence technician named Ochoa, exhausted past the point of good judgment, had been tasked with getting 2 of the recovered textiles, the hardest, densest pattern of the 6, a lap quilt in faded blue gingham, professionally cleaned and stabilized before a fiber specialist could examine the thread tension without contaminating it further. He'd used a rideshare. The rideshare app had auto-filled the wrong drop location from a saved address 6 months stale. The quilt, in a plain canvas garment bag with a federal chain of custody tag zip-tied to the handle that nobody had bothered to remove, ended up at 9:47 p.m. on the counter of Reyes & Son, 60 feet from where Marisol Reyes was closing out the register with a rubber band around a stack of ones. Delfino, half-deaf, mostly gone for the night already in the sense that mattered, took the bag, said, "Thursday then," to a driver who wasn't listening either, and went home. Marisol found the bag at 6:02 the next morning, tagged, mislabeled, government evidence property stamped in red ink she did not yet understand the weight of, sitting on her cutting table like any other rush order. She almost called the number on the tag to say there'd been a mistake. She almost did the responsible thing immediately. Then she unzipped the bag to check the fabric for pre-existing damage, muscle memory, 22 years of habit, and she saw the stitch pattern on the quilt's back panel, and her whole body went still in a way it had not gone still since her father's funeral. It wasn't random. It was wrong the way a chart is wrong when someone's miscounted on row 6. Silence. The kind that has a texture, the kind you can feel in your molars. She did not know it was a cartel code. She did not know it was worth $41 million, or that 2 people were already dead over it, or that a man with a clock behind his sternum was, at that exact moment, 3 floors above a conference room table, deciding whether to have Alvaro's cousin killed for incompetence. She knew only what her hands knew, that whoever had made these stitches had made them in groups of 5, that the tension shifted by exactly 1 thread width on a completely arbitrary schedule that wasn't arbitrary at all, and that 4,000 cross-stitches don't lie to a woman who has spent 11 years finding the 1 wrong stitch buried inside them. At 9:58 a.m., an agent named Priya Okonkwo, the only one of the 20 who still had her jacket on, the only one who hadn't given up on protocol even at hour 71, walked into Reyes & Son to retrieve the misdelivered evidence bag, because the chain of custody tag had finally, 3 hours too late, triggered an alert. She found Marisol Reyes sitting at her cutting table with the quilt spread flat under a desk lamp, a magnifying glass in one hand and a school notebook in the other. 3 columns of numbers already filled in handwriting so neat it looked typeset. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from that. That's federal evidence." Marisol did not look up. "It's a shipping manifest." Silence again, the building settling kind. "Excuse me?" "Groups of 5 stitches. That's your date. Day, month, last 2 digits of the year. Split middle. Every 7th group, the tension's off by exactly 1 thread width. And that's not sloppy work. Nobody's hands are that consistent by accident. So that's your marker. Location code, cross-referenced against whatever key they're using for these." She tapped the christening gown photograph clipped, absurdly, to the outside of the evidence bag. "Same hand, same 7-group rule. You've got 3 quilts and this gown giving you 4 separate shipment windows, and I'd bet good money, which I don't have, so don't test me, that the tablecloth's the key itself. It's not a code, it's a ledger. Somebody's grandmother taught the wrong grandson how to embroider." 90 seconds. Agent Okonkwo would clock it later. Exactly, because it would matter for the report. 91 seconds from the moment Marisol Reyes picked up the magnifying glass to the moment she set it back down and said, flatly, "Where's my $233? 20 agents crowded a room built for 14, and every single one of them stopped talking at once when Priya Okonkwo walked back in with a seamstress from Ashland Avenue and a school notebook full of numbers that broke 71 hours of nothing in under 2 minutes flat. Esteban Marchetti was not there. Esteban Marchetti did not attend federal task force meetings on account of being the reason the task force existed, but he had a man inside, Alvaro's second cousin, a low-level liaison nobody suspected of anything, a man whose entire job was to sit in rooms like this one and report back before the ink was dry. And by 11:40 a.m. that Thursday, Esteban Marchetti was staring at a photograph of a woman he had never met, taken from 40 feet with a long lens, standing on the sidewalk outside a Pilsen dry cleaning shop with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a look on her face like she was already calculating what time the 49 bus came. He looked at that photograph for 4 full minutes without speaking, which for the men in the room with him was its own kind of alarm, because Esteban Marchetti not speaking was worse, always, than Esteban Marchetti speaking quietly. "Find her," he said. "Don't touch her. Bring her to me. Boss, she cracked it for the feds. She's compromised. She's the only person in this city who can read what Ruiz's people can't." A pause, the kind that had its own gravity. "Find someone who reads thread. I told you that 4 days ago." Morning arrived above Reyes and Son the way it always did, grey and smelling of the previous night's rain trapped in brick. Except this time, there was a black Suburban parked across the street that hadn't moved in 40 minutes, and Marisol Reyes noticed it the way she noticed everything now, the way you notice a held breath. The feds had paid her $400 cash for consultation, handed over by Agent Okonkwo, with the flat discomfort of a woman who knew the number was an insult and had no authority to fix it. $400 against a $233 gap felt, briefly, like winning. It had lasted 6 hours. Then Delfino had told her, not unkindly, that the shop couldn't have federal agents traipsing through the register anymore, and that maybe it was best if she took some time off, unpaid, until things settled. Things settling was Delfino's phrase for Marisol having no income. She was 3 blocks from the shop, walking toward the 49 stop with her canvas bag, and $1,317 total to her name. The $400 plus what was left of the $917, minus a grocery run for beans and rice, and a birthday card for her mother, she still hadn't mailed, when the Suburban's window came down, and a man's voice, quiet, almost bored, said her name like he'd known it his whole life. Marisol Reyes. She stopped. She did not run, mostly because 22 years of exhaustion doesn't leave a woman much running left in her. Cedar and gun oil. Underneath it, faint, something like church incense, the kind that stays in a suit collar for days after a funeral. She would learn later that Esteban Marchetti had come that morning from precisely that, a funeral, one of the 2 men who'd died misunderstanding his order to find someone who reads thread. "I'm not getting in that car," she said. "I didn't ask you to." He got out instead, which surprised her more than the car had. A man like that, she knew what he was within 4 seconds of looking at him, not from television, from the specific quality of quiet that surrounded certain men in Pilsen who owned buildings nobody could explain how they'd bought. A man like that did not get out of cars for people like her. People like her got put into cars, or didn't, and either way the man stayed seated. "You read the quilt in 90 seconds, he said. 20 federal agents, 3 days. I count stitches for a hobby. It's not witchcraft. I have 11 more like it. I'll pay you what the government should have. I don't do business with men who make people disappear." She said it flat. The way you'd say a fabric was ruined. No drama in it. Just information. "I saw the funeral flowers on your lapel before I saw your face. I'm not stupid. I'm just broke. Those aren't the same thing. Whatever your friends in the room upstairs decided about me." Silence. The building settling kind, except there was no building, just a wet Pilsen sidewalk and a bus that was now, according to the app in her pocket, 4 minutes out. For the first time in longer than any of the 6 men standing at a discreet distance behind him could remember, Esteban Marchetti did not have an immediate answer. A woman who made $14.50 an hour under a folding table had just told him no to his face on a public sidewalk, correctly identified him as a man who disposed of bodies, and was checking a bus app while she did it. 90 seconds, he said again, quieter. Not a question, almost to himself. You want to know something for free? Marisol said, already turning toward the stop. That tablecloth is the key. Whoever took it from you already knows how to read the rest. You're not behind because you lost the code. You're behind because you're still asking 20 men in suits when you should have been asking women who work with their hands for a living. Nobody in that building has held a needle since kindergarten. She got on the bus. It rattled off toward Western Avenue. Esteban Marchetti stood on the sidewalk for 11 seconds. His men would count it, later, the way you count anything about a man like him that's never happened before. And then he said, to nobody, to the wet air, find out everything about her landlord. He offered $40,000 first. She laughed. One short, exhausted sound, not unkind, the sound of a woman who has been offered things all her life that turned out to be traps with better lighting. They met the second time on her terms. The shop, after hours, Delfino gone, the bell over the door doing its one clear note and its rattle. She sat behind her own cutting table this time, on her own chair with the bad back support, because that chair was hers, and nothing about this conversation was going to happen with her standing. 40,000 for what, exactly? She said. Because if the answer's reading thread, that's a skill, not a leash. I want that written down somewhere, and I want to know what happens the day I say no to something and you decide I've become a liability. You won't be a liability. That's not an answer. That's a threat wearing a nice suit. Cedar and gun oil. Closer now. Across a cutting table stained with 22 years of chalk marks. I don't make threats to people I need. Everybody's needed right up until they're not. She pushed a swatch of blue gingham fabric, a scrap she'd kept, illegally, from the original quilt, not for the code, but because the thread count had bothered her. Unfinished business. The way a wrong stitch on row 6 bothers you for the rest of the piece. An inch toward him across the table. Here's my actual terms. I don't touch anything that gets somebody killed directly. I get paid through something my accountant, I don't have an accountant, I'll get one, can explain to the IRS without going to prison. My landlord doesn't get a call from you. I never meet your competition. And the day I want out, I'm out. And nobody comes to Ashland Avenue to remind me, I used to work for you. That's not how this business works. Then I'm not in this business. She stood up. The chair creaked. I fix hems, Mr. Marchetti. I have done that since I was 12 years old, in this exact building, next to a man who is currently dead and did not leave me a note about what any of this was supposed to add up to. I am not going to let the first interesting thing that's happened to me in a decade turn into the reason I end up in a quilt myself. She walked him out. The bell rang its one true note. He stood on the sidewalk a second time, and for a second time, he did not immediately leave. 3 of his men came back the next afternoon, without him, and it went worse. They were not cruel, exactly, but they were used to people saying yes eventually, and their patience had a shorter fuse than his. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Gutierrez, who wore too much cologne for a job that should have required none, set a manila envelope on her cutting table, with $15,000 in it, cash, no note, and said, "Boss said think it over. This is just so you know we're serious. Tell your boss I already told him no once for free, and I'm not selling it cheaper the second time." She slid the envelope back across the table, careful not to touch the bills themselves, the way you'd handle a fabric you didn't trust the dye lot on. And tell him, if he wants an answer, he can come get it himself, instead of sending men who smell like they showered in a gas station. Gutierrez left the envelope where it sat. Marisol did not touch it for 6 hours, until Mr. Petrakis's rent notice arrived taped to her door at 7 p.m., and then she counted it. 15,000. Real, uncut, more money than she had ever held in one place in her life, and put every dollar back in the envelope and mailed it, at her own expense, $22.40 in postage she genuinely could not afford, to the return address Gutierrez had, stupidly, left printed on the outer packaging. She kept the receipt. She did not know why, except that some part of her understood already that a woman who kept receipts was a woman who intended to survive whatever came next with her paperwork in order. 4 days of silence followed that. 4 days in which nothing arrived on her doorstep. No envelopes, no black Suburbans, nothing but the ordinary grinding math of rent and hems and a landlord's tired face. And it was in those 4 days that Marisol understood, for the first time, what she had actually turned down. Not just money, an escape from arithmetic that had run the same losing equation every month for 11 straight years. She went back to Hems. For 4 days, she went back to Hems, and the 4 days were the loudest silence of her life. Theodora's wedding gown got finished, ivory silk, hem perfect, and Theodora cried and paid in full, and Marisol stood in the empty shop afterward, holding a check for $180 and doing the math she'd been doing her whole life. Rent, mother, gas bill, the birthday card still unmailed, and the math still didn't work. The $400 from the feds was gone. Delfino's time off had become, without either of them saying it plainly, not coming back, because a man named Ruiz's people had asked around Ashland Avenue about the seamstress who'd cracked a federal case, and Delfino, 61 years old and half deaf and not stupid, had decided his shop's insurance did not cover this. Friday came. Mr. Petrakis came with it, tired-faced, not cruel, holding a clipboard he didn't want to be holding. "I like you, Marisol. I liked your father, but I've got a building to run." He didn't say eviction. He didn't have to. That night, cold, the specific brittle cold of a Chicago March that hasn't decided if it's still winter, Marisol sat in her apartment above the empty shop with a bowl of cereal she was, for once, sitting down to eat, and looked at a business card with no name on it, just a phone number, that a man smelling of cedar and gun oil had left on her cutting table without her seeing him do it. She thought about her father's unfinished hem. She thought about the wrong stitch on row 6 that ruins row 200. She thought about $233, and then about a landlord's tired face, and then, unbidden, about the specific quiet weight of a dangerous man standing on a wet sidewalk not leaving. She called the number. "I'm in," she said, when he picked up on the second ring, like he'd been holding the phone. "But my terms stand. All of them." "They stand," Esteban Marchetti said. She hung up first. It was the only leverage she had left, and she used it. It felt, that whole first night, like closing her hand around a beautiful trap and choosing, with her eyes fully open, to let the trap close. 2 weeks in, they took her to a warehouse in Cicero that smelled of machine grease, and, underneath that, the specific sweetness of decaying flowers from a shipment of funeral arrangements gone unrefrigerated 3 days too long. A smell that would follow this particular job for the rest of her life, in the way certain smells follow you. The second test was not a quilt. It was 11 of them, plus 4 tapestries, plus a set of hand-embroidered baby blankets recovered in a raid on a rival stash house, all delivered in one shipment, all needing to be cross-referenced against each other inside 6 hours, because Ruiz's people were, according to Esteban's intelligence, 4 hours from moving a shipment of their own based on a partial decryption they'd gotten from a captured courier under duress. Whatever they'd gotten wrong would get people killed either way. Whatever Marisol got right, first, would decide whose people it was. She worked at a folding table under bad fluorescent light with a magnifying lamp Esteban had bought her. Not the whole shop's worth of equipment she'd have wanted, but exactly the equipment she'd have wanted, which told her something about how closely he'd been paying attention. Alvaro hovered. Alvaro sweated. Alvaro, she would learn within the hour, was also the reason the original shipment had gone dark in the first place, because Alvaro had been selling small pieces of Esteban's shipment schedule to Ruiz for 8 months, a little at a time, a habit that had started as a debt payment and calcified into something closer to a second job. She found it by accident, the way you find the one wrong stitch, not because she was looking for a traitor, but because the 7th group tension marker, the location code, her own discovery, 3 weeks old and already the backbone of the whole system, appeared on one baby blanket in a hand that was almost right. Almost. A half thread too loose on the 4th marker. Consistently, across 4 separate pieces, the specific, consistent, almost right of somebody who'd learned the code secondhand, from watching, not from making it themselves. Whoever taught the counterfeit code, she said, without looking up, to the room in general. Learned it from someone who only sees the finished pieces, not someone who stitches them fresh. That's not one of your seamstresses copying wrong. That's someone photographing the output and describing it to someone else. She looked up then, at Alvaro specifically, because his hovering had gone very still. You'd know who handles the photography end of quality control. She hadn't set out to find him. That was the part that would sit strangely with her for weeks afterward. That the truth had simply surfaced the way a wrong stitch always surfaces, not through suspicion, but through pattern, through the same grid holding that had nothing to do with loyalty or betrayal, and everything to do with thread tension being a fact, not an opinion. She laid the 4 baby blankets side by side under the magnifying lamp and traced the 7th marker on each with the eraser end of a pencil, the way her father had taught her to check a client's measurements twice before cutting once, and the almost right kept repeating itself in the same 4 spots, in the same slightly too loose half thread, 4 separate times, which meant one person, working from a photograph, guessing at a tension they had only ever seen finished and never felt forming under their own fingers. Whoever's copying this, she said, mostly to herself, learned it the way you'd learn a song from hearing it through a wall. Close, but they never touched the instrument. Alvaro, 12 feet away, had gone very quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent hum. The silence that followed did not have a texture, it had a weight, and the weight sat directly on Alvaro's chest, visible in the way his breathing changed before anyone said a single accusing word. Esteban Marchetti, standing at the back of the warehouse, in a coat that had never once been wrinkled, said only, "Take him to the East Dock." Quiet, almost bored, the same register he'd have used to order coffee. 2 men moved. Alvaro did not run, mostly for the same reason Marisol hadn't run on the sidewalk 3 weeks earlier. Exhaustion outpacing fear, the body simply refusing the expense. Wait. Marisol stood up so fast her chair went over backward with a clatter that seemed enormous in the warehouse's quiet. What does the East Dock mean? Esteban looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did something it had apparently not done in years, which was hesitate. "It means he doesn't talk to Ruiz's people again," he said. "That's all you need." "That's not an answer. That's the same threat wearing the same nice suit. You said you didn't want to touch anything that gets somebody killed directly." His voice stayed level, stayed quiet, but something under it had gone very careful, the tone of a man measuring a woman he had started, against every instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades, to actually consider. "You haven't touched anything. I have. That's the arrangement you asked for." She did not have an answer for that. She picked her chair back up, sat down, and finished the last 3 blankets in silence. And the silence this time had her own weight in it, the specific weight of a woman realizing exactly how far into the trap her hand had already gone. Rain arrived by midnight, the fine cold kind that doesn't so much fall as hang. And it was in that hanging rain that Esteban Marchetti found Marisol Reyes sitting on the warehouse's loading dock steps, with her knees pulled up and her canvas bag beside her, not crying, just still, in the specific way of someone doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. He sat down beside her, not close, close enough. "Bourbon?" he said. And it wasn't a question, it was a bottle he'd produced from somewhere inside that coat, along with 2 paper cups that would have been at home on any conference table in the city. "I don't drink. Neither did I, until I was 19. He poured anyway, 1 cup, set it near her hand, didn't push it further. You get used to needing something for your hands to do. She looked at the cup. She looked at his hands. No rings, 1 old scar across 2 knuckles. The specific stillness of hands that had learned, a long time ago, never to shake in front of anyone. She thought of her own hands, thimble core loosed, chapped from spray starch, and realized she was looking at a man whose hands told the same kind of truth hers did, just for a different trade. "What happened when you were 19, she said. Silence, the kind with texture. My uncle put a gun on the table in front of me and told me to use it or leave the family business standing there with my hands empty. A pause. I used it. I've had a clock in my chest ever since. telling me how many hours I've got before the next table. She took the bourbon. She didn't drink it, not right away, just held the cup the way she held a needle before the first stitch of a new pattern. A moment of respect for what was about to change. "My father died mid-hem," she said. "Wedding dress. I finished it because somebody had to, and it turned out that was the whole shape of my life waiting behind that one afternoon. I've been finishing other people's unfinished things ever since. Never once had anybody finish anything for me." He reached over, slowly enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, and touched the inside of her wrist, where a thin white scar sat from a rotary cutter slip in her 20s, a mark she'd stopped noticing years ago, the way you stop noticing your own name. "What's this from?" "Being careless once, at 19, same as you." A small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Difference is, nobody died when I got it wrong." His thumb stayed on the scar, a second longer than either of them needed for the conversation to make sense. Neither of them moved away first. The rain hung. Somewhere behind them, in the warehouse, someone was hosing down the east dock, and neither of them looked toward that sound, by unspoken and total agreement. "I grew up 4 blocks from where you grew up," he said. "Different side of 26th Street. Same dirt." "I know," she said. "I could smell it on you the first day. Incense and cedar don't cover it all the way up." "You could have killed him yourself," she said. After a while, the rain still hanging, neither of them moving to leave the wet steps. "Instead, you sent 2 men and a phrase. That's a choice, not a habit. It's both." He turned the paper cup slowly between 2 fingers, not drinking, the same way she wasn't. "A habit you choose enough times stops being a choice. I stopped noticing the difference around the time you were finishing your father's hem." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Compare us like we're the same kind of tired. You chose your clock. I inherited mine." She finally took a sip of the bourbon, grimaced. It burned exactly the way she'd expected, the way anything worth being careful about burns, and set the cup down harder than she meant to. 12 years old, standing next to my father's body, finishing a stranger's wedding dress, because somebody had to, and there wasn't anybody else in the room. Nobody handed me a gun and asked me to choose. Nobody's ever handed me anything. I'm handing you something now. You're handing me 41 million reasons to keep answering your phone calls. But she said it without heat, and they both heard the difference between that sentence and the one she'd have said 3 weeks earlier, on the sidewalk, with a bus 4 minutes out, and every door still open behind her. He reached over again, not sudden, not asking permission with his eyes the way men did in movies, just slow enough that stopping him would have been easy, and she didn't do it. And this time, it wasn't the scar on her wrist. It was 2 fingers, lightly, against the thimble callus on the side of her right middle finger, the hard, shiny pad that 22 years of needles had built there. "This is the part of you that saved my $41 million, he said. "Not the money, not the men. This. That's the most honest thing you've said to me since the sidewalk. I don't say honest things often. It's bad for the clock." She almost laughed. It came out instead as something quieter, something that sat in her chest next to the hammering that had started the moment his fingers touched hers and hadn't stopped since. A thing she would not, could not, name out loud, because naming it felt like the first stitch of a pattern she couldn't afford to start pulling loose again once it caught. They sat like that until the bourbon went cold in the cup, and neither of them had taken more than 1 sip, and nothing else happened, which was, somehow, the loudest thing that had happened between them yet. 3 nights later, in a different warehouse that smelled of new paint and, faintly, of the same decaying flower sweetness that never fully left her clothes now no matter how many times she washed them, Marisol Reyes stood over a final tapestry, the last piece of the Ruiz decryption, the one that would tell them, within the hour, exactly where the missing $41 million physically sat, with Esteban Marchetti at her shoulder and 6 armed men at the door, and a phone in her pocket that had, 20 minutes earlier, buzzed with a text from Mr. Petrakis that read simply, "Rent's covered. Somebody dropped off an envelope. Don't ask me who." She had asked for exactly none of that. She knew precisely who. She finished tracing the 7th marker with 1 finger, felt the half-thread give under her nail the way a wrong stitch always gives, different from a right one, softer, and looked up at Esteban Marchetti in the bad fluorescent light with the specific stillness of a woman who has just understood, all the way down, that there is no clean door out of this particular room anymore. "It's a warehouse on Cermak," she said. "Sub-basement. You're going to want a locksmith, not a battering ram. There's a false wall keyed to a specific tension pattern, same family as the code, and if somebody kicks it in wrong, it collapses the whole shipment into the river drain underneath. Whoever built this system built it paranoid all the way down." Behind her, one of the 6 armed men at the door, a young one, new enough that his boots still had store crease in them, got a call on a burner phone and went pale in a way that made the whole room's temperature drop 2 degrees before he'd said a single word into it. "Ruiz's people are already moving on Cermak," he said. "Now, not later tonight, now." Esteban Marchetti did not raise his voice. He never did. But something in the room changed anyway, the way air changes right before a storm actually breaks, instead of just threatening to. And 6 men who had been standing at ease a moment earlier were suddenly not standing at ease at all. "How many hours?" Esteban said, and everyone in the room understood he wasn't asking about hours in any calendar sense. He was asking about the clock behind his sternum, the one that had been running since he was 19, the one that had just started running for 2 people instead of 1. "Less than 1, the young man said. Marisol Reyes looked at the tapestry in front of her, at the false wall keyed to a tension pattern only she could read correctly on the first try, and understood, with the specific, clean, cold clarity of a woman finishing the last stitch of a very dangerous pattern, that there was no version of the next hour where she wasn't going to that warehouse herself. "You need somebody who can read the wall in real time," she said, "not somebody who kicks it and hopes." "No," Esteban said, flat, immediate, the fastest he had answered anything since the sidewalk. "That's not a threat, wearing a nice suit this time. That's just true. You go in wrong, you lose the money, and everyone's standing near that false wall when it collapses into the drain. I'm the only person who's touched that tension pattern with her own hands." She was already reaching for her canvas bag, the same one she'd carried onto the 49 bus 100 lifetimes ago, that first Tuesday morning. "You wanted someone who reads thread. This is the part where that stops being a metaphor." Esteban Marchetti looked at her the way, she understood now, he had never once looked at anyone in that warehouse, at anyone in the room upstairs, at anyone at all who wasn't a threat or a tool. "You're the only person alive who could have told me that," he said. Marisol Reyes picked up her canvas bag, checked the time on her phone and said, flat, deadpan, the specific dry understatement of a woman whose whole life had trained her never to let a room see what a thing actually cost her. "Great! Now somebody still owes me for 2 quinceañera dresses I never finished hemming this week, and if the 49 bus doesn't come in the next 4 minutes, I am going to be late for absolutely nothing, because I don't have a job anymore, on account of you." Delia. No, Marisol Reyes did not become a legend on Ashland Avenue. She became a woman who kept the lights on, who mailed her mother's birthday card 3 weeks late with an extra 20 folded inside, and who still, some nights, sat at a folding table with a magnifying lamp doing the one thing in her life that had ever been entirely, unquestionably hers. She had cracked in 90 seconds what 20 federal agents couldn't crack in 3 days. She had said no to a dangerous man's money and then said yes to his terms instead, on her own conditions, with her eyes open the whole way down. Whether that made her the smartest woman on 26th Street, or the latest name added to a list of people who thought they could hold a beautiful trap at arm's length, that part, even she couldn't have told you yet. What happens when the woman who reads the code becomes a line item the code itself is trying to protect, and when a man who has never once hesitated finally does, over a scar on somebody else's wrist? Does that hesitation save her, or is it the first stitch in a pattern that gets both of them killed? Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. If you like this one, hit like, share it with somebody who needs a good story tonight, and subscribe with the bell so you don't miss the next chapter.